Hey guys, welcome back to another Revenge of the Remakes. I figured I'd kick off the month of March, the month of Easter, by talking about one of my favorite Christian franchises from when I was a teenager, and except I haven't really watched these movies in a while, so we'll see if they hold up.
Revenge of the Remakes.
Left Behind and Left Behind, or I guess it's Left Behind the movie and Left Behind. That's the official title. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to be referring to the version that came out in 2000 as the Kirk Cameron version and the version that came out in 2014 as the Nicolas Cage version, because I figure that's what most people call these movies anyway. But let's get into it. So Left Behind originally was a book, or a book series, that got started in 1995, and it was already a huge phenomenon in Christian circles. I can only assume it had a similar cultural impact to what The Chosen is doing right now in theaters and on streaming. However, the big difference is that this is not an adaptation of a biblical epic. It's not a period piece. I guess technically you would consider it a science fiction apocalypse movie based on the book of Revelation. So yeah, what the writers of Left Behind did is they took the book of Revelation, all the prophecy about the Antichrist and the end times and the Battle of Armageddon and all that really metaphorical and hard to interpret stuff in the book of Revelation. They tried to contextualize it in the framework of what if all that were to happen in 1995, or the not too distant future of 1995. And because of that, yeah, in the Kirk Cameron version, there are things that come off as a little dated and maybe not entirely relevant. Like, for instance, there's no reference to social media or AI or any of the several societal issues that we're dealing with in 2024. This movie posits that in the not too distant future, a man named Nikolai Carpathia is going to seize control of the World Security Council of the United Nations and basically make himself president of the entire world. And if you're at all familiar with the prophecies in Revelation, that seems very similar to a certain Antichrist figure. And yeah, that's exactly what it is. The movie doesn't pull punches. It was a Christian book, it's a Christian movie, so obviously the Christian themes and messages are front and center. It's not exactly subtle. Although what I find so fascinating about these Left Behind movies, and is really present in every Left Behind movie that I've seen, are the ideas that are brought forward. Yeah, these movies can come off as preachy or a little in your face at times, but the ideas of what would Revelation look like if it was taking place in contemporary society is an eternally interesting concept. And if we as Christians know that the end is coming and we take the book of Revelation seriously, we know that there are things in society that continue to push us further and closer to the apocalypse. And it's just inherently cool to see which parts of society mash up with scripture. For instance, the 10 members of the World Security Council are basically an equivalent to the 10 kingdoms that the Antichrist will rule over in the book of Revelation. And probably the biggest central idea in both of these movies is the rapture itself. Now, nobody knows the day or the hour that the rapture is happening, and it seems like everybody has their own theory about when in the prophetic timeline that is going to happen, and it's admittedly vague, we don't know for sure. But both of these movies posit the idea of a pre-tribulation rapture, that all of God's children will be sucked out of the earth, raptured up into heaven, before the really bad stuff starts happening. And those that are left behind, well, those are the people that we follow throughout this whole franchise. And let's start off this comparison video by comparing our main characters. Now, even though I referred to the 2000 one as the Kirk Cameron one and the 2014 one as the Nicolas Cage one, Kirk Cameron and Nicolas Cage do not play the same character. So I guess I'll talk about Kirk Cameron's character first, Buck Williams. And in the remake, he's played by Chad Michael Murray, who you might recognize from the Cinderella Story and I think Freaky Friday. He was in a few different Disney things. But here he is also Buck Williams, and Buck Williams in both versions is a reporter from GNN, or I think in the remake it's GCN. Doesn't make much of a difference. He's a news broadcaster. He's a big name. People know him. People recognize him in the airport and stuff. And he's the kind of guy that will go into incredibly dangerous war zones and chaotic environments just to get the story. He believes in the truth above everything else, but just like all of our main characters in these movies, he is not a Christian and gets left behind. I gotta say, both these actors do a good job with the Buck character, although I think the script benefits Kirk Cameron's character a lot better because we actually get a full character arc with him in this first movie. With Chad Michael Murray, he doesn't really get that fulfilling character arc of him coming to Christ in the face of all this disaster and unrest going on. And with Kirk Cameron's depiction, we do see a lot more of that, and there's a very effective scene where Kirk Cameron realizes the truth. He puts all the pieces together after doing a lot of investigating and a lot of questions and answers. And it's when he sees firsthand prophecy about the Antichrist and the 10 Kingdoms and the temple being rebuilt that he was warned about explicitly a couple scenes ago. He just breaks down, has a moment in the bathroom where he comes to faith, and it is played very straight. It's played without a lot of pomp and circumstance. It's just a beautiful scene. It's a broken man with nowhere else to go, and he just turns to God. And we see his whole demeanor, his whole perception of the world change from that point on. And we really don't get any of that in the remakes. And it's not just Buck Williams that doesn't get a full arc. It's also Rayford Steele, Nicolas Cage's character, arguably the main character in all of these movies. He's the through line. And in the Kirk Cameron version, he's played by Brad Johnson, and in both versions, he's basically the same character. He's a pilot. He's not entirely faithful to his wife. He's seeing this flight attendant, and in both versions, it's a little vague as to the exact nature of their relationship. In both versions, you get a lot of flirting, and in the remake, you actually see Nicolas Cage take off his wedding ring before he goes on the flight, which I don't think he does in the Kirk Cameron version, but if you go by the Kirk Cameron version, you get a lot more context in the later movies that, oh, maybe they did have a few one-night stands, maybe they did actually have a little bit more of a secret relationship than was initially implied. I think a lot of this vagueness is actually a detriment to both movies. I really wish we could get a Left Behind movie that isn't afraid to actually say whether or not Ray and Hattie slept with each other once, twice, multiple times. And I think that vagueness is because these are Christian films and they want it to be safe for all audiences. They want churches to be able to play it without their congregation getting offended. And personally, I just feel like when biblical movies do that, when they try to sanitize the story to an unrealistic degree, it just hurts the film, and at worst, it just makes the characterization confusing because you're not given enough information to form an opinion about these characters and who they are and how they relate to each other. Like I alluded to, Nicolas Cage isn't given a kind of conversion moment like we saw in the original, and Brad Johnson definitely has a conversion to Christ very early on. After he lands the plane, he is so confused by everything. He tries to find his family, and then he goes to church, and he does find answers there, and he converts, and his attitude changes, and he tries to fix some of the things that are broken in his life because of that. And again, we don't get any of that with Nicolas Cage. Yeah, he kind of puts together on the plane what happened and that maybe his wife and son were right about this whole Christianity thing, but you don't really get a very compelling turning your life to Christ scene that we got in the original with really all of our main characters. Every one of them is given a come to Jesus moment, a turning to Christ moment. And while it is handled with a little bit of cheese, it's again made in the 90s and it's a Christian company. Obviously, if you're not a Christian, you're going to see this as a little unrealistic. However, if you are a Christian, you can relate to a lot of these scenes happening on screen. The moment that you turned your life to Christ is probably very similar to some of these scenes. This first Left Behind movie probably handles all of the conversions and all of the character arcs with a shocking level of sobriety and subtlety that isn't really seen often in Christian filmmaking. A lot of Christian films have a big moment, it's very dramatic, and the music kicks on, and everyone says this prayer that clearly was written by a Christian screenwriter that no new convert would actually pray. But here, they're praying in very plain English that just feels so much more relatable and realistic. And if you're wondering how come nobody in the remake gets these conversion moments, well, that's because the Nicolas Cage version entirely takes place on the plane. And if you're at all familiar with the storyline of Left Behind, you know that the plane stuff is really only the first third of the movie. There's a lot of other stuff that happens, like I talked about before, with the Antichrist and the UN and the building of his empire and the one world currency and all these things that are moving forward, bringing us closer to the end times. And the Nicolas Cage version really doesn't seem to care about any of that. All the Nicolas Cage version cares about is being a disaster movie. That's clearly its goal because, again, the entire movie takes place on this plane, and we get a little bit of build-up off the plane. We're introduced to all of our characters. That's great. But once they're on the plane and the rapture happens and about half of their passengers disappear, the plane doesn't land until the very end. And the entire movie is just a bunch of people panicking and pointing fingers and trying to figure out what happened to these passengers. They're trying to find a place to land, and then they start leaking fuel, so it becomes even more urgent. And it's basically snakes on a plane if there's no snakes and the rapture happens, and the rest of the general plot is basically the same. Maybe if you're in the mood for that kind of disaster movie, you'll like the movie fine, because it does have a few exciting action sequences or disaster sequences where you're a little on the edge of your seat because you don't really know how this is going to play out. And the actual climax where they try to land the plane with the help of his daughter who's trying to clear a path on the deserted highway, that's actually a pretty exciting sequence, and it did keep my attention. But it doesn't quite work for me because nobody really has a character arc. You don't really care about any of these characters, except for Chloe, played by Cassie Thompson in this version, and she's the daughter of Ray the pilot, and she actually does go through her own little faith journey while she's on the ground while everyone else is up in the plane, and that's kind of okay. But if you're going into this movie expecting a Left Behind remake with a modern budget that doesn't have a whole bunch of 90s cheese on it, you're just gonna be so disappointed. I know I was when I walked out of the theater when I saw this, because I did see this in the theater. I was so excited that Left Behind was getting a remake because I remembered loving the original when I was a kid. But I walked out of the theater thinking, okay, so there's no Nikolai Carpathia, no Antichrist, no UN summit, no consolidation of power, no one world government. They don't even mention rebuilding the temple. We don't even see the Magog invasion. Oh yeah, that's another thing, because there is a separate prophecy that's also end times related about the Magog invasion, and nobody really knows when this is going to happen. But in the Kirk Cameron version, they put that right at the beginning of the movie. The first time you're introduced to Buck Williams, he is reporting in Israel on this new project. Planes and missiles headed for Israel, and they just all start blowing up for no discernible reason. Right when they get to the outer edge of, I think it's Jerusalem, or it might just be all of Israel itself, they just start blowing up for no real reason. And that is prophesied that the enemies of Israel will all unite and launch a full-scale attack, and that Israel will be protected in all of that miraculously. It actually serves a couple functions. One, it's really cool to see this realized on film. It's a very exciting way to open the movie. And two, it shows Buck Williams' character, that he will be the guy that's standing in a war zone with planes exploding overhead, still reporting the news. So yeah, really these are two fundamentally different movies. The Nicolas Cage version is definitely a disaster movie, but if you're gonna do that, why have it with the Left Behind name when you know that there's this whole wealth of story that you could tell that you just decided to only use the first third of and stretch that out for an entire movie? I don't understand it. The more I think about it, the more frustrated I get, because there's absolutely no world building going on in that movie. There's no Black Mirror style science fiction elements that make you think, oh, maybe we're not so far off. Whereas all that is present in the original, it just feels like a more complete story and picture of what the end times will be. And on top of that, the Kirk Cameron version has a very somber tone. It takes its time with its characters. All these characters are grieving the loss of somebody, whether it's the loss of family or loved ones, or in the case of Pastor Bruce, a pastor who actually got left behind because he didn't fully believe in what he was preaching. That is a fascinating idea and is woefully underutilized in the remake. I think Pastor Bruce only has like one scene with Chloe, and that's about it for him. Whereas in the Kirk Cameron version, he is a main character. He gets just as much screen time and development and intimate moments with God praying that the other characters do, and the movie is just so much richer because of that. And yeah, it's cheesy, it's an apocalyptic movie, and you kind of have to know that going in if you're gonna take this movie at all seriously. But I feel like even with that, the characterization is still so much more fleshed out. The world is so much more fleshed out, certainly more than the remake, but also more than most Christian films tend to have. This movie surprisingly holds up in my eyes. Now I turn over to you guys. What do you think about Left Behind, either the Kirk Cameron version or the Nicolas Cage version? And did you see the Nicolas Cage version in theaters when it came out? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby, this is my Nerdy Talk, and I'll see you in the next video.